In the fall of 1983, I landed on Mars and I met a few aliens. At least that is how I felt. The place where I actually landed was West Virginia University. I was coming from Ivory Coast in West Africa, where I'd graduated from high school. When I arrived on my floor at Arnold Residence Hall, many students were in the hallway, and there was a lot of excitement in the air. So I asked them what was going on. Several of them answered at the same time. "A student is coming from Africa." I was happy to hear that, so I asked them, "Oh, so there's another student from Africa?" If the atmosphere had been a balloon, it would have deflated quickly, as they blurted, "What do you mean by another student from Africa?" "I'm African," I answered, to which the disappointed response was, "You don't look African." I was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a baseball cap. As I walked to my room, I wondered what they were expecting. Well, I found out over the next few days, as some students asked me if I lived in a tree, if I hunted and fished daily for my meals, and if I had a monkey as a pet. I guess they thought I would arrive with a grass skirt and my pet monkey. I decided to answer all their questions by yes, and I told them Disney-worthy stories about my life in Africa. Maybe like me, you've been in a situation where you've been stereotyped with a limited perspective of who you are, based on your race, your gender, your nationality, or another characteristic. The reality is that every human being has complex layers of cultural identities. Which cultural identities have the most influence who you are today? All our cultural identities interact with one another, so it doesn't make sense to stereotype people and base our perception of them on a single characteristic. Dr. Susan Fisk, a social psychologist at Princeton University, explains that to simplify our mental processing, we use shortcuts and we place people in simple categories to help us draw conclusions immediately. However, these shortcuts too often result in stereotyping, which dehumanizes people and diminishes them to a label that does not represent them as a whole, and often not at all. As I got to know the students on my floor at West Virginia University, I realized that their questions and comments were not ill-intentioned. They had acted out of ignorance about Africa. So I gave them grace and actually developed friendships with several of them. I quickly felt at home at the university, thanks to the lessons that life had taught me and that I will share with you shortly. As a result, in my second year, I became the resident assistant for the French floor in Arnold Hall, and I was featured in the West Virginia University brochure and the housing section. The style of the 80s was interesting, wasn't it? Unlike my floor mates at West Virginia University who had acted out of ignorance, in too many cases, people act with the intention to hurt. FBI data indicate that the number of hate crimes reported in the US has increased by nearly 42% since 2014, with the greatest increase consisting of crimes against Blacks and Asians. The criminals in these cases are people who acted on their hatred. But for every criminal, there are thousands of people who believe the world should be like them and look like them. Their world is divided into us versus them, and they stereotype and even hate those who are different from them. It is true that learning to deal with cultural differences is hard, because as human beings, we tend to gravitate toward people who are similar. However, we can expand our cultural boundaries when we are motivated to do so. So who is the most powerful change agent to promote cultural understanding and build a bridge across cultures to go from us versus them to we? So who is that most powerful change agent? My answer? You and I, and every person around the world. I believe the greatest potential for impact is at the individual level, recognizing that as individuals, we can influence the families, organizations, and communities we belong to. I am currently working as a certified change manager with Social Impact, a consulting firm. For nearly 3 years, I've worked with leaders of operating units within the US Agency for International Development, developing and implementing strategies to help staff adopt and embrace change. And one thing I have witnessed time and again is that change happens one person at a time. So how can each of us help to bring about the much needed change in our society? I have been working on an answer since I was 13. I spent each trimester of that school year in 3 different countries: Ethiopia, England, and then Ivory Coast. And I had to go through many changes, including social norms and language. And the challenge of having to adapt to 2 very different countries in less than a year helped me jumpstart my journey of cultural self-awareness. The lesson I learned that year can be summarized by a quote in the Talmud by Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani, who states that we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. Therefore, change must begin with each one of us. It is important that we each become more aware of our own cultural lens and understand how it influences the way we see and experience the world. Such an awareness can also help us to recognize that others might have a different cultural lens. As human beings, we often don't realize that our culture influences our thoughts and behaviors. It influences what we think is valuable, what we think is right or wrong, what we think is normal or not. Let's go through a few examples that demonstrate how people from different cultures might look at the same thing and react differently. If you have a meeting at 10:30 a.m., do you arrive at 10:15, at 10:30, or 10:45? What do you think about Chinese President Xi Jinping not making eye contact with the American Secretary of State John Kerry as he shakes his hand? Do you think he's being rude or respectful? Do you think there's something shady going on between French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel? Or do you think it's a normal way of greeting each other? If there were a beauty contest, which of these women do you think would win? These are the 3 finalists of an African beauty contest in Canada that required applicants to be at least a size 16. So what does this tell us? Beauty standards, like many other beliefs, are not universal. Our beliefs regarding time, eye contact, personal space, beauty, and many other factors are shaped by our culture. Whatever our answers to the questions I just asked, there are many cultures in which the responses would be quite different. The challenge with developing cultural self-awareness is that we often have blinders as we define our cultural lens. Based on my experience, the best way to develop cultural self-awareness is to get out of the comfort of our own culture and interact with people from cultures different from our own. The more different the culture, the more we learn about our own. In 1995, I was working with a UN agency in Senegal, which is my home country, although I didn't live there until I was 28. One of my assignments was to conduct interviews with partners in the agriculture sector to help develop an agriculture program for women. One morning, I went to interview a technical specialist in the Ministry of Agriculture. When I entered his office, I extended my hand to greet him. To my surprise, he put his hands behind his back and said, "I am an Ayatollah, and I do not shake women's hands." I was shocked. An Ayatollah is a religious leader among Shiite Muslims, and he didn't look like one to me. I was imagining a look more like Ayatollah Khomeini's from Iran, a long robe, a long beard, and a head covering. He was wearing a suit and was clean-shaven. I realized that my assumptions about how an Ayatollah looks like were wrong. I was anxious about talking with him because I suspected that he would disrespect me because of my gender. I wanted to run away, but I had a job to do, so I awkwardly took the seat that he pointed to. Fortunately, I saw a University of Maryland souvenir on his desk, and I exclaimed, "I got my master's at University of Maryland." The ice broke, he smiled, and he said that his daughter was pursuing her bachelor's degree there. I asked him how she liked it. He said she loved it and was doing well, and suggested we start the interview. I was ready. I no longer saw him as a disrespectful misogynist. That was actually the last time I extended my hand to men in Senegal, which is about 95% Muslim. If they initiated the handshake, I responded. I learned from relatives and friends that both Muslim men and women may refuse to shake hands with the opposite sex because they believe there should be no physical contact between men and women who are not married or closely related. As a result of this knowledge, I no longer had any apprehension about meeting other Ayatollahs or people I'd perceived as quite different from me, or even threatening. I felt like my world expanded. We really see the world as we are, and not as it is. My experience with the Ayatollah taught me two additional lessons. First, that it is important to change our assumptions and perceptions based on new information. The second lesson was the power of looking for and finding areas of commonality or intersection that create a sense of connection. As I said earlier, research indicates that the more we interact with people from cultures different from our own, the easier it becomes. In July 2016, I was invited as a keynote speaker to a 3-day conference in Miami. Although I was scheduled to speak in English, I learned that most participants were native Spanish speakers, and they hadn't understood the 2 previous speeches in English. So I spent the next 2 nights translating my slides into Spanish with the help of Google Translate. Jesus, a professor from Mexico who kindly offered to serve as an interpreter, reviewed my slides and made corrections. On the day of the speech, I introduced myself in Spanish and decided to give the whole speech in Spanish, knowing that I would make mistakes. Fortunately, the professor and the audience responded when I needed help with a word or a phrase. Why do you think I was able to speak in Spanish when I believed I didn't speak it well enough? I was able to do it because I wasn't focusing on myself or my limitations. I wasn't worried about making a fool of myself. Instead, I focused on the needs of participants to understand me and my message. As a result, I had one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. As you can see, I was beaming as I walked out of the conference room. And that picture was used to advertise the conference the following year. When we get out of our personal bubbles and allow our hearts to come along for the journey, we are able to transcend our fears and limitations and show empathy to others. At the end of my talk, which was on cultural intelligence, Alicia, a lady from Cuba, came up to me with tears in her eyes. She shared that she had been living in Miami for more than 10 years and didn't speak English. She'd always complained that Americans didn't make her feel welcome. She said that listening to me made her realize that she had been wrong to assume that Americans didn't want her in their community. And she admitted that her wrong assumption resulted from her own insecurities. As a result, she hadn't done her part to adapt to the US. She ended her conversation by promising to learn English to be able to develop relationships with Americans. Alicia applied 2 of the lessons I shared earlier. First, she recognized that she saw the world as she was and not as it is. Second, she dared to change her assumptions and perceptions. Wherever you are in your journey of cultural self-awareness, you can be a catalyst to promote cross-cultural understanding in your community. It starts with you and me. We can each overcome our mental barriers and build momentum toward the goal of cross-cultural understanding by calling on our sense of empathy. Let's have the courage to take off our cultural lenses and try on those of people from other cultures. Let's do something outside of our own cultural group. Here are a few things that you can do. If you live in a relatively wealthy neighborhood and have never interacted with the homeless, serve at a soup kitchen. If you have never been to a place of worship other than your own, accompany a coworker or friend who attends a place of worship different from your own. Go to a museum to learn more about another country, race, or religion. Seek opportunities to experience other cultures. The reward will be that your mind and your world will expand. Thank you.